All right. Let's dive right in. Today we're tackling the World Trade Organization.
The WTO.
Yeah, the WTO, an organization that honestly shapes a lot more of our world than I think most people realize.
It really does. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that the WTO influences everything from like the price of your morning coffee to the kind of car you drive.
Exactly. And we're going deep on the WTO using excerpts from its Wikipedia article, pulling out the juiciest bits to give you a clear picture of what it is, how it functions, and why it should matter to you.
Right.
So to kick things off, can you give us the elevator pitch? What is the WTO in a nutshell?
Yeah, so in essence, the WTO is kind of like the rulemaker and the referee for global trade. You know, its goal is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly and predictably as possible between nations. So think of it as the organization that's trying to ensure that your like favorite products from around the world can actually like make it to your local store.
Okay, so it's like the WTO is trying to create a level playing field for countries to exchange goods and services.
Yeah.
But I read that the WTO itself isn't an agreement. It's an organization built on agreements.
Right.
What's that all about?
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about it. It's not just one big document that everyone signs on to.
Right.
It's actually a whole collection of agreements.
Yeah.
Negotiated and agreed upon by the countries that make up the, vast majority of global trade.
Mm-hmm.
And these agreements set the legal ground rules for international commerce.
So it's like a giant rule book with all these different chapters on how countries should handle things like tariffs and quotas.
Exactly. And the aim of these agreements is to lower the barriers to international trade, to get rid of those obstacles that prevent goods and services from flowing freely across borders.
And this whole system, it has its roots in something called GATT, right?
Yeah.
The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
GATT.
Yeah.
Yeah, so GATT emerged after World War II with this goal of reducing trade barriers, particularly tariffs.
Okay.
And over time, GATT kind of expanded its reach to cover more aspects of trade. And eventually, countries decided to formalize the system, creating a dedicated international organization, and that's how we got the WTO.
That brings us to the WTO's official birth date, January 1st, 1995.
Yes.
So it essentially inherited GATT's mission, but with a more permanent structured setup.
Absolutely. The WTO provides this forum for countries to kind of like hash out trade agreements and, importantly, to settle disputes.
Okay.
It's all about creating a more stable and predictable trading environment.
Okay, so we've got this organization built on agreements, striving for smoother global trade.
Right.
What are some of the most impactful principles the WTO operates on?
So one of the cornerstones is the most favored nation principle.
Okay.
And in simple terms, it means if you grant a trade favor to one country, like lowering tariffs on their exports, you have to extend that same favor to all WTO members.
No playing favorites.
Exactly, no playing favorite.
That makes sense. Can you give us a real-world example of how that plays out?
Yeah, so imagine a country, let's call it Chocotopia.
Okay.
That's crazy for cocoa beans. They strike a deal with another country to import those beans at a reduced tariff.
Yeah.
Because of the most favored nation principle, Chocotopia has to offer that same lower tariff to every other WTO member exporting cocoa beans.
So this principle incentivizes countries to offer their best trade terms from the get-go, because they know it won't just apply to one lucky trading partner.
Exactly.
It levels the playing field from the start.
Precisely. It prevents a scenario where one country gets an unfair advantage over others.
And then there's the national treatment principle, right? That one sounds intriguing.
Yeah, so this principle is all about preventing discrimination against foreign goods and services once they're inside a country's borders.
Okay.
So you can't give your own domestic products an unfair leg up through like special taxes or regulations just because they're homegrown.
So using our Chocotopia example, they can't slap a hefty tax on imported cocoa beans just because they weren't grown domestically.
Exactly. The goal is to ensure that once goods clear customs, they're treated fairly in the marketplace, regardless of their country of origin.
This is all starting to paint a clearer picture. But what happens when countries can't agree on trade matters?
Right.
Do we end up in a world of trade wars and retaliatory tariffs?
Well, that's where the WTO's dispute settlement system comes in.
Okay.
This system is a core function of the WTO and is often considered one of its most important achievements.
It's like a global court, specifically for trade.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about how that works.
You got it. So if one country believes another WTO member isn't playing by the rules, they can bring a case to the WTO for a ruling. There's a formal process, consultations, a panel of experts, and ultimately a binding ruling. It's a system designed to resolve disputes peacefully and keep those trade disagreements from escalating into something bigger.
And do countries actually comply with these rulings? I imagine there's some pressure to follow the WTO's decisions.
Yeah, there's a strong incentive to play by the rules. If a country ignores a WTO ruling, they risk facing retaliatory measures from other countries, which could lead to, a tit-for-tat trade war, something everyone wants to avoid.
So it's not just about setting the rules, it's about having a system in place to uphold them and keep things fair.
Exactly. That's what makes the WTO more than just words on paper. It can act when needed.
Now I'm curious about the WTO's decision-making process. Is there like a World Trade Council making all the big calls?
It's actually more democratic than that and more complex. Decision-making at the WTO operates on consensus,
Okay.
which means all member countries have to agree.
Wow, getting 164 countries to agree on anything sounds like a monumental task. How does that even work in practice?
It's a balancing act for sure. These negotiations often take place in what are known as rounds. Countries come together to hammer out, new rules and agreements on a wide range of trade-related issues.
I've heard of the Doha Development Round, which, if I'm not mistaken, has been in the works for quite some time.
You're right. The Doha Round, launched in 2001, was intended to address the needs of developing countries in the global trading system. However, it's been stalled for years due to disagreements on key issues like agricultural subsidies.
That really highlights the challenges of achieving consensus on a global scale. There are so many competing interests at play.
It's incredibly complex. Think about it. You have to find solutions that work for the economic giants and the developing nations, each with their own priorities and concerns.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've covered the WTO's history, its structure, and how it aims to regulate global trade.
Yeah.
But what's been the tangible impact? What difference has the WTO actually made in the world?
That's the key question, right? It's difficult to isolate the WTO's impact on something as massive as the global economy, but there's no doubt it's contributed significantly to the increase in international trade since its inception.
Okay.
The WTO estimates that global trade has increased by over 500% since the 1950s.
Wow.
That growth has brought jobs, economic growth, and a wider array of goods and services to people worldwide.
A 500% increase. That's astounding. So part of that growth can be attributed to the WTO's work in lowering trade barriers and creating a more predictable trading environment.
Precisely. Businesses feel more confident about trading internationally when they know the rules of the game and have a reliable mechanism for resolving disputes. This confidence translates into more investment, more trade, and ultimately more economic activity.
But it's not just about economics, is it? Does the WTO play a role in fostering peace and cooperation between nations?
Many people believe that increased trade and economic interdependence can contribute to a more peaceful world. The logic is that countries with strong trade relationships are less likely to resort to conflict. It's in their best interest to maintain those economic ties.
It's like the old adage, when goods don't cross borders, armies will. Trade can build bridges and mutual interests.
Exactly. While the WTO isn't a peacekeeping organization in the traditional sense, it fosters cooperation and dialogue, which can contribute to greater understanding and stability on the global stage.
We've talked about the WTO's achievements, but we also need to acknowledge the criticisms leveled against it. Some argue that the WTO's focus on free trade can sometimes come at a cost. For example, concerns about environmental protection and labor standards.
That's right. Some critics argue that the push for free trade can sometimes undermine environmental regulations or that the WTO doesn't do enough to protect labor rights in developing countries.
Okay.
These are valid concerns and part of a larger debate about balancing economic growth with social and environmental responsibility.
It sounds like finding that balance is a constant challenge for the WTO. They're trying to create a fair and open trading system while also addressing the concerns of those who feel left behind or disadvantaged by globalization.
Absolutely. And it's not just about finding a balance, but about adaptability. The world is changing rapidly, and the WTO needs to keep pace.
What are some of the most pressing challenges the WTO faces in today's world?
Well, the WTO is facing challenges both internally and externally. We've already touched on the difficulties in achieving consensus among its diverse membership. The stalled Doha round is a prime example of that. Then there's the changing geopolitical landscape.
The rise of new economic powers and increasing trade tensions between these major players are adding layers of complexity to an already challenging landscape.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the growing skepticism of globalization in some parts of the world. People are concerned about the impact of free trade on jobs, wages, local communities. The WTO is trying to navigate these very real anxieties while also advocating for the benefits of a more open global trading system.
It sounds like the WTO is at a crossroads.
Yeah.
It has a remarkable track record of facilitating trade and has contributed to unprecedented economic growth. but it's also facing criticism and pressure to adapt to a changing world. What are some potential paths forward? How can the WTO evolve to remain relevant and effective in the 21st century?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? There are many different viewpoints on this.
Right.
Some argue that concluding the Doha round, even if it requires compromises, is essential for restoring faith in the multilateral trading system.
Right.
Others suggest focusing on smaller, more achievable agreements that address specific contemporary issues like digital trade or the green economy.
So instead of trying to get everyone on the same page for a massive overarching agreement, focus on targeted solutions for pressing global challenges.
Exactly. This could allow the WTO to demonstrate its value and make tangible progress without getting bogged down in these endless negotiations. There's also a growing chorus calling for greater transparency and inclusivity within the WTO.
What would that look like in practice?
It could involve giving developing countries a more prominent voice in decision-making, providing them with increased technical assistance to implement trade agreements, making the WTO's processes more accessible to the public.
Essentially making sure that the benefits of global trade are more equitably distributed and that everyone has a seat at the table.
Precisely. The WTO needs to find ways to address those concerns head-on if it wants to build a more sustainable and inclusive trading system for the future.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the WTO's history, its inner workings, its successes, and its challenges. It's a lot to absorb, but I think it highlights something crucial. The WTO isn't just this abstract concept. It has a real impact on our lives, whether we realize it or not.
It absolutely does. The WTO's decisions influence the prices we pay for goods, the availability of products in our local stores, and even the relationships between nations. Understanding how it works, the challenges it faces, and its potential future is more important now than ever before.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, and we appreciate you joining us as we unpack this complex and vital organization. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring the intricacies of our interconnected world.